Next, we'll be hearing from Dr. Tom Everrett, Curator of Communications at Ingenium, Canada's Museum and Science and Innovation Museum. Tom's paper, The Electronic Sackbut Project, is an Ingenium-initiated project to build a hybrid mechanical digital reconstruction of the electronic sackbut in order to deepen our understanding of the instrument. Tom, do you want to come down?
Hello, everyone. So I don't know if we can put the first slide on the screen. Perfect. So thank you, Jesse. Thank you, AMIS, Studio Bell, and National Music Center, and all of you for this opportunity to speak today. And thank you, Gail, for setting the stage so well in our discussion of the electronic sackbut. I should start by saying that I'm by no means an expert in vintage electronics, so any strong opinions I express today are informed by friends and colleagues who are. I take no responsibility. And also, if there's anyone who would benefit from any image description of the slides, please let me know now, or during the presentation I'd be happy to describe any of the visuals. Does anyone have a need for that? Okay, cool. If you change your mind, let me know. Okay. So here's a photograph of the electronic sackbut, designed and built by Canadian Hugh Le Caine between 1945 and 1948, as it appears today. You can see in the credit line for this photo, that, and many others I'll be showing you today, that it was actually taken by Don Kennedy here at the National Music Center. I'll have more to say later about why the instrument spent some important time here on loan, but we'll get into that later. So the electronic sackbut was acquired by the Canada Science and Technology Museum in 1972, in unplayable as-is condition, and it was never restored or changed in any substantial way. So what you see here is pretty much what it looked like when it arrived at the museum in 1972, and pretty much what it sounded like too. Beautiful looking, but silent. Of course, it wasn't always this way. And I will say that it says sackbut with two T's. The image Gail showed, I think they actually blacked the other T out because he had misspelt it when he originally wrote it, but we don't know for sure, but that's why that's there. Anyway, here's an audio clip of Hugh Le Caine playing an experimental piece he wrote specifically for the instrument called the Sackbut Blues. It was recorded in 1954 and is among the last recordings of the instrument ever made.
The next selection was written especially for the sackbut. When a composer writes a piece of music, he attempts to induce in the listener a specific mood or feeling. Here it is a mood best characterized as low down. I believe you will agree that a new peak in low downness has been achieved. The title is the Sackbut Blues.
So whenever I hear this, I'm amazed that we're listening to an electronic synthesizer being played by someone who had built one from the ground up almost 2 decades before anyone else. But I'm also left wondering what else the sackbut could do if it was freed from the aesthetic confines of late 1940s, 1950s musical culture. To be completely blunt, the recording makes the instrument seem rather outdated and perhaps even a little bit quaint. But in reality, it's anything but. The electronic synthesizer is a powerful and highly capable electronic instrument, even by today's standards, with a unique control interface that I think musicians and composers today would be able to do some incredible things with, if only we could give them the opportunity to play it. This is one of the reasons why we've decided to make the instrument playable again. to make the world's oldest synthesizer new again in order to garner some excitement around its creative potential. Another reason is to garner some respect for, or even just an acknowledgement of, Hugh Le Caine's achievements as a pioneer of electronic musical instrument design, which is so often missing in popular celebrations of the early history of synthesizers that tend to focus on people like Bob Moog, Don Buchla, and others in the 1960s. A third reason is to gain a better understanding of its ergonomics and instrumentality. Right now, we can easily look at photos of Hugh Le Caine playing the sackbut, listen to his recordings, and get a general idea about how the sounds, about how he was creating the sounds that he was creating. And we ourselves can sit down at the sackbut artifact, place our fingers on the keyboard and on the controls, and imagine what it might have been like to create those sounds. But there's a significant gap here. Because Le Caine was never filmed while playing the sackbut, it's impossible to say for sure exactly how he was achieving the sounds he was producing while playing. We can certainly make educated guess based on our research, but we can't say for sure. Which begs the obvious question: if we have the instrument in our possession, why don't we just power it up and play it? The answer, sadly, is that although this would be the ideal scenario, the instrument remains as unplayable today as it was when we acquired it 50 years ago. And the steps required to make it playable would be disastrous for the continued preservation of the artifact. And I'll give you a brief tour around it now to show you what I mean. Okay, so here's what the electronic sackbut looks like under the hood. To the right, you can see some of the core components that make up what I refer to affectionately as the rat's nest. A complicated mess of brittle wiring punctuated by old resistors, swollen capacitors, burnt-out vacuum tubes, rusted sockets, you name it. Plus a bunch of wires that seem to go nowhere, thanks to broken solders that have either fallen off over time or were removed by Le Caine when he was tinkering. It's nearly impossible to know for sure. Here's a view of components spilling out the right-hand side of the instrument. In the back. And a view from the left side, which gives you a nice cross-section of the nest. And finally, here's a close-up of just one component to give you a sense of the kinds of aging, degraded, and complex electrical clusters we're dealing with. This is not the kind of thing you can just swap a part or two out of to make a repair. To restore full and safe electrical functioning would mean gutting the electronics and replacing them with either modern components or good quality vintage components. In either case, gutting, and by extension destroying, the instrument's original electronics is not something I nor any previous curator has been willing to do, particularly when the electronics are part of what makes this artifact so historically significant. Of course, the electronics are just one thing. On the mechanical side, from a restoration standpoint, things are equally complicated. Going to the left-hand controls, you can see here this dried orange sponge would need to be scraped out and replaced with a new one so that the pinky controller could sit where it's supposed to sit, which is about an inch or two higher, and spring back as it was intended. This is a kind of mechanical restoration work that would be destructive and irreversible. You couldn't just put the original sponge back when you were done. It would just crumble to dust during the removal process, and we'd lose that material connection to the original instrument forever. And that's just one example of many like this. More significantly, the wood surrounding the keyboard has also warped over time, seriously impacting the action of the keys. So you can see by looking at the pins underneath the keys that the high keys press down about an inch and a quarter, and the low keys barely move. This is not at all how it would have been when Le Caine built and used it. The warping has also locked the key tray in a fixed position, meaning you can't shift it from left to right. Having a movable key tray was a significant feature of the original instrument. It's how Le Caine was able to achieve vibrato, by physically moving the key tray when he wiggled his fingers. So if we were to restore the instrument to playable condition, we'd have to remove all the wood surrounding the keys. Basically everything you see painted black, including the panel that says Electronic Sackbut, and replace it with unwarped cuts of wood. And this too would be irreversible, as it's highly unlikely the warped pieces would ever fit in again. Once the tension was released, it's unlikely they could ever be reinstalled. There are other issues. The original instrument used a powerful high voltage current in such a way that players would need to be extremely vigilant to keep from getting electrocuted while they were playing it. Another component, the timbre controller with the index finger, required frequent coating and recoating of a carcinogenic and long outmoded substance called aquadag. So depending on how important authenticity was to the restoration project, we'd have some serious health and safety concerns to contend with. And we haven't even talked about the PCBs and the capacitors, of which there are dozens in the instrument, which are technically illegal to manufacture and use in Canada today, certainly by public institutions such as ours. So lots of problems. In short, after months of consultations, we concluded that it's simply not possible to restore the instrument, at least not without destroying many of its key components, that is, many of the things that make the artifact so historically significant. So am I here to just report on a failed project? No, far from it. Rather than throw the towel in, we decided to shift the project from a restoration project to a reconstruction project. This will allow us to leave the original artifact intact, but still test our existing theories, develop new insights and new lines of research, and most importantly, play and hear the original electronic sackbut, or something very close to it, for the first time since 1954. And before moving on to a discussion of the reconstruction project, I just want to take a brief aside and come clean on a lie I just told. Strictly speaking, the last time the sackbut was played wasn't 1954, it was 2017, and it was in this very building. I mentioned at the start of the presentation that we loaned the sackbut to the National Music Center in 2015, which is when they took the great photos I've been showing. But the actual reason for the loan was not to take photos, which were very nice, but to seek the NMC's help in assessing and documenting the instrument from an electronics perspective. While it was here, John Lymesider, or JL, who was the electronics tech at the time, managed to disassemble enough of the components and safely isolate them in order to try powering up the instrument. Incredibly, he succeeded. He wasn't successful in getting the whole instrument going, far from it. He confirmed, as we suspected, that there was way too much destructive work involved, but he did manage to get the main oscillator and keyboard controller going so that he could play some notes on the keyboard. And lucky for us, the NMC also arranged to have this recorded. So here it is, the first time since 1954, and likely the very last time the electronic sackbut artifact was ever played by John Lymesider.
So yesterday we plugged in the electronic sackbut for the first time in many, many, many years. And we had only 2 keys working. And I did a little bit of work this morning on that and found that with just very, very minor key contact adjusting, we've got most of the keys working. And we have a little bit of audio we can listen to. It's the direct output from the oscillator. It doesn't have the dividers or any of the filtering going on. It's just the plain oscillator. So a lot is not working, but there are things on it that are. And we'll have it on the oscilloscope over here on my right. And you can hear the audio from it. And we'll just play it chromatically. There are 4 or 5 keys that are not working well or at all, and you'll be able to see that also. So there's our lowest note. That's around 1K. And there's our highest key, and that's around a little bit over 10K.
Apologies to any dogs in the room. So given the age and condition of the artifact, this was an extraordinary achievement. Not only did JL get the main oscillator and keyboard working, he was also able to draw some of the first ever circuit diagrams of the instrument, which was a major step forward in our understanding of the sackbut's electronic architecture. Sadly, we lost JL only a few years after he completed this work. But no matter what we're able to achieve with our reconstruction effort, our team will always be grateful for his work, and to Jesse and the rest of the National Music Center's team and support in laying the groundwork that made this, and no doubt future projects, possible. Okay, so where are we at now? Well, after taking a few years to assemble a team, find some funding, determine the best course of action, and of course, weather some COVID-related delays, we're finally nearing the completion of our first prototype of the instrument. The reconstruction is a hybrid mechanical-digital reconstruction. By this I mean it uses physical mechanical controls modeled as closely as possible visually and ergonomically to the original Sackbut's controls as you see them here, paired with a custom digital sound engine that will provide the sound that these controls produce. We opted to go digital rather than analog with this first ever reconstruction of the instrument to keep the focus on the ergonomic and instrumental aspects and not get too hung up on splitting hairs on the original electronic circuits. This isn't to say we can't make that the focus of a future reconstruction project, but for now our research is focused on discovering exactly what the instrument would have been like to play and what the full range of its musical potential was. And we can do that without replicating all the original electronic circuitry. On the mechanical side, we're well on our way. So you can see here our designer fabricator, Denis LaRouche, taking measurements of the Electronic Sackbut artifact outside of its display case at the Canada Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa. He's currently in the process of building the structure and the left-hand controls, so unfortunately I can't show you images of those today, but I can show you the keyboard and the key tray, which he completed in March. So here's a process shot of some of the first cuts of the black keys. Here are the white keys cut with their plastic caps installed. Here they are installed in the key tray, and note the rough wooden support boards that, in true Le Cainian fashion, were repurposed from a wooden pallet Denis found in the street outside of a Canadian Tire. And finally, here's the completed keyboard with the keycap tips trimmed and the key sides trimmed and rounded, as Le Caine had done, for either ease of sliding between notes or for achieving a smooth vibrato, or both. Testing will confirm that. We may still artificially age and weather the keys to match how the instrument looks today, rather than how it may have looked in Le Caine's day, but we're leaving it this way for now. When Denis finished the rest of the build, the reconstruction should look and feel pretty close to the original, packing crate, support structure, and all. On the electrical digital side, we're even further along. We've managed to figure out what most of the controls do, have established parameters for things like the timbre control and formant control, which aren't clearly articulated in Le Caine's writings. And we have the whole thing programmed within our custom digital sound engine. All that's left to do now is hook up the keyboard and physical controls when they're completed and refine the programming once we're able to sit down and properly play the instrument using Le Caine's recordings as a sonic guide. At that point, we should, for the first time really, have a complete understanding of exactly how the instrument functioned, which will allow us to start phase 2 of the research project, which is refining our understanding of exactly how the instrument was and could be played. I'm going to end the presentation now with a short video demo of the sound engine by Ed Egan, who's our synth expert and instrument software designer, who's leading the programming side of the project. In this video, Ed takes some time to demonstrate some of the Sackbut controls using a stand-in Continuum keyboard. The Continuum, like the Sackbut keyboard, not only has up-down key dynamics, but also side-to-side vibrato functionality, so it's a good stand-in for the demo. I'd recommend focusing your attention on the frame to the left, which shows how he's manipulating the Sackbut controls on his screen in order to achieve different sonic effects. This is quite a limited demo in the sense that he can't adjust more than one control with his left hand at once. Using the mechanical components in the final reconstruction when we're done, you'll be able to manipulate 4 controls simultaneously. So modulation with the pinky finger, timbre with the index or middle finger, and then your formant with the thumb, and then you could also affect reverb with your foot, with a foot pedal. So that's on top of any experimentation you do with the preset control, so that's the knobs on top. And there you've got control over your attack, your glide, sensitivity, tune, octave, etc. Ed leaves those more or less fixed in this video, so just know that there's far more to the instrument and far more the instrument can do than is reflected in this demo. But it does offer a nice comparison to the audio track of Hugh Le Caine playing his composition, the Sackbut Blues, that I played earlier. Just hearing Ed experiment casually with the control interface, even in this limited form, starts to scratch the surface of what I'd hoped we'd achieve by undertaking this reconstruction project. the offering of tangible proof that the electronic sackbut was, and remains, a deceptively powerful electronic instrument that deserves far more recognition and excitement than it has received in the 1974 years since it was originally completed. So without further ado, here's Ed on the electronic sackbut sound engine. It's about 2 minutes long. All right, so that's it for me. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And thanks very much.
Use?
Oh, good question. We have no idea. Yeah, so what we're using, we just bought a Roland keyboard amp for now, and we can get creative with the 1940s radio amp or something down the road if we feel it's necessary. But for now, there's no documentation, there's no images, we have no idea. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I want to ask about the aesthetics of the object, which are obviously striking. I think, you know, it's, I mean, and maybe a little anxiety-inducing at times. But I mean, it's one of the things that makes it such a compelling artifact, but it also raises the question about, did Le Caine see, I think what I'm trying to get to is that there's for me, a tension between the fact that he seemed to want people to find this instrument compelling. The demonstrations he did, those recordings, are really quite polished in a lot of ways, and yet the look of the instrument is, you know, even by prototype standards, very raw. And so, I mean, do you have a sense of, you know, was there ever an attempt to create a more polished instrument? I mean, I'm just thinking compared to the Tritonium, you know, from 10 years earlier, or the Theremin, which were both kind of made as almost like furniture case grade objects. You know, what was his approach in terms of, you know, having this as such a kind of almost found object?
There's a very long answer to that question, and Gail is the best person to answer it, but I'll take a stab. So with this one, this is proof of concept stuff he was doing on his own in his basement. So he was trying to work quickly and just see what he could do and play with ideas. So it was very much an engineering project or a physics project. when it actually was working, he could then sort of do the things that he was doing and demonstrating it. But he was never satisfied with it in its current form, and it had problems. So he had already, by the early 50s, started designing a second version and working on that. That version has since been lost. Probably he just ripped it apart because it wasn't exactly right. There was an attempt to build a commercializable version in around 1970, 1972, and hit the market, but by then the Mini Moog and everything are already out. There's a lot of momentum, and then there was some incompetence by some of the people that they got involved with trying to develop this into a packaged consumer object, so it never got off the ground. And all this time, Le Caine was building dozens of other instruments. We have about 20 in our museum collection for a whole bunch of different Canadian universities, McGill, Queen's, University of Toronto. So he had other things on the go, and he wasn't really interested in commercializing. He was interested in the ideas for this kind of musical instrument. So that's the short version.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Well, I'll ask this real quick. So, Tom, thanks for the presentation. Really great. A couple of technical questions. Is the formant shifting voltage controllable with the keyboard? Does it scale with the keyboard, or is that a possibility, or is it formant control only from your left hand?
It's only controllable from your left hand, and that would be from your left hand.
Okay.
Yeah, the keyboard just plays.
Okay. And the reverb source, was it a spring or was it a plate or?
Spring.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a spring reverb that you control with the pedal.
Would he take just an off-the-shelf Acoutronic spring reverb from whatever and?
Your guess is as good as mine.
Okay. And one quick observation, Don Buchla was here visiting us a few times actually over the early Cantos NMC years. And one day in my home, I had a copy of the Le Caine disc of the CD. Pardon me, I don't remember the name of the CD itself. But and Don had no knowledge of Hugh Le Caine at all. So it was an amazing sort of epiphany for him to hear all this music. And we discussed a little bit about what I knew about it, which wasn't that much until JL came along, of course. But Don was blown away by what Le Caine achieved and how he got there, with especially the tape recorder, et cetera, just completely mesmerized him. And it's great that we're digging in and acknowledging this history. And for somebody like Don Buchla not to know about it begs that we need more information. So.
Oh, absolutely, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And I think Moog knew about him before Moog got started. So I still haven't found the smoking gun where there's like a letter back and forth or something, but it's hard to believe that Moog would have gotten started without knowing of everything that Le Caine was doing and setting up these studios and everything. So yeah, that's another smoking gun I'm hoping for.
Hi, I'm Jonathan from the University of Edinburgh.
Hey, John.
I have a question from the conservation point of view. So are you taking any steps, and what steps are you taking to prevent the original artifact to continue deteriorating? There's many parts that are plastics or the sponge or the capacitors that will continue to degrade. And are you doing anything about it, and how?
It's a good question. It's in better. It's been kept in pretty good condition the whole time. While it was at the museum, it was in an environmentally controlled room. When it was on loan here, it was well taken care of. And since it's been back from loan, we got it back in 2017, and that's when it went on the new exhibits. We rebuilt the Canada Science and Technology Museum, and it was one of the instruments put in. So it's in a humidity-controlled case of tinted glass and with tightly controlled light. But other than that, there's nothing hands-on happening right now with stabilization or anything. There will need to, the capacitors I'm terrified of, because they're starting to be a little bit swollen. Every time we even move it out of the case to take more measurements or study it more, I'm just terrified that one of them will jiggle and rupture, and then we've got PCBs leaking in, and then everything gets shut down, and then we're in trouble. So we're going to have to be proactive, especially with the capacitors. But at this point, truthfully, it's just kind of keep it going and cross our fingers.
Cables and the sponge, like that sponge is going to continue to deteriorate.
Yeah.
It's just nothing.
There's not much we can do about it. I mean, there's a potentially, try some sprays or something to adhere and fix it in place. We're in the middle of moving our whole collections to a new facility, so everything is stopped on this this side of things, but we're hoping once we're all moved in within a year, we're going to have to, pay more attention because it is going to keep degrading. Thanks.
I'd just like to observe, it's my impression that there's nothing random or accidental about the appearance and the materials that he used. He very deliberately made it look like this because it would have been a lot easier to make it look more rational. I think he deliberately made it look this way as an expression of his sense of humor, which I think was remarkable. And the reuse of an old harmonium keyboard, for example, and the way he shaped the sides of the keys. He could have handled that in a much simpler way if he'd wanted to, and I think he really chose to make it look the way it does because he wanted to evoke a certain response in whoever was observing it. It wasn't just for himself. I think he had an aim to reach people with a certain message in that design.
Yeah, and it's amazing that you mentioned that. I'm just seeing the flashing light. I should wrap up. But I will say one other thing. That's one of the reasons why we're rebuilding it as well, is the hand controls, the pinky and the thumb control. Are those specifically designed to be the ergonomically best way to function those or control those? Or were they found on the floor and he kind of quickly shaved them and installed them? We don't know. And that's by playing it, we'll get a sense of, oh, no, this is the best way to build this controller, or it wasn't. And we'll see. But thanks. Thanks, everyone.